The soft morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Metropolitan Ballet Company's practice room as Amara stood in front of the mirror, carefully adjusting her pristine white tutu. Her fingers moved with practiced precision over the delicate fabric, smoothing out invisible wrinkles. At 24, she was one of the company's most gifted soloists, though that title often felt like a glass ceiling she couldn't break through. The practice room was quiet this early in the morning, just how she liked it. The wooden floors still smelled of fresh polish, and the mirrors reflected the peaceful solitude she had grown to cherish. This was her time, before the other dancers arrived, before the pianist took his seat, before the artistic director's watchful eyes began their daily assessment. Amara had arrived at 6 a.m., as she did every morning, to practice her variations. Her dedication wasn't just about perfecting her craft, it was about being twice as good just to be considered half as worthy. She had learned this unspoken rule early in her ballet career, back when she was the only black girl in her local dance studio. The sound of her phone ringing cut through the silence, making her jump slightly. She didn't recognize the number, but as a professional dancer, she knew better than to ignore any call. It could be an opportunity, and in this competitive world, opportunities were like rare gems. "Hello," she answered, her voice echoing in the empty room. "Amara? This is David from Event Coordination." The voice on the other end sounded slightly frantic. "We have an emergency. Isabel, our principal dancer, has come down with food poisoning. She can't perform at the Richardson family's annual charity gala tonight." Amara's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. She knew the Richardson Gala well. It was one of the most prestigious private events in the city's social calendar. Every year, they hired the company's principal dancer to perform. It was the kind of opportunity that could change a career overnight. "We need someone who knows the Dying Swan variation," David continued, his words tumbling out quickly. "The artistic director mentioned you've been understudy for this piece." Amara smiled to herself. She had done more than understudy the piece. She had practiced it countless times in these early morning sessions, perfecting every movement, every gesture, every emotion. In her heart, she had always known that someday she would need to be ready when her moment came. "I know the piece," she said simply, professional as always, though her pulse was racing with excitement. "Can you do it? The gala starts at 7 p.m. We need you there by 5 for final preparations and costume fitting." "Yes," Amara replied, her voice firm and confident. "I'll be there." After hanging up, she turned back to the mirror. Her reflection showed a woman on the brink of something big, something she had worked toward her entire life. She took a deep breath, raised her arms to first position, and began to move through the choreography one more time. Her movements were fluid, graceful, telling the story of the dying swan with every gesture. As she danced, she thought about her mother, who had worked 2 jobs to pay for her first ballet lessons. She thought about her first teacher, who had told her that ballet wasn't just about the perfect technique, it was about touching people's hearts. She thought about all the little girls who might see her on stage and realize that their dreams were possible too. The morning light grew stronger as she danced, casting her shadow across the floor. She didn't know about the storm that awaited her at the Richardson estate. She didn't know that her presence would challenge years of prejudice and tradition. All she knew was that she was ready to prove that art knows no color, that talent deserves its moment to shine, that sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones that break the mold. As she finished the variation, holding the final pose with perfect precision, Amara allowed herself a small smile. Tonight, she wouldn't just be dancing for herself. She would be dancing for every dancer who had ever been told they didn't fit the right image, for every artist who had been passed over despite their talent, for every dreamer who refused to let others define their limits. Inside the luxurious Richardson estate, the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows as David Chen paced the marble floors of his office. His phone felt heavy in his hand after ending the call with Amara. 20 years as an event coordinator had taught him to handle every crisis with calm efficiency, but this situation was different. This time, he had deliberately chosen to shake things up. The truth sat like a weight in his stomach. The Richardsons hadn't just requested Isabel for her technical skills, they had specifically asked for her because she maintained their event's traditional aesthetic. David had heard these coded phrases too many times over his career, watched too many talented dancers get passed over for the wrong reasons. Today, something in him had finally snapped. He glanced at the photo on his desk, his grandmother, who had been a dancer in China before the Cultural Revolution ended her career. She had always told him that art should transcend boundaries, not create them. Her words echoed in his mind as he reviewed the evening schedule one more time. The sound of clicking heels against marble made him look up. Patricia Richardson, the family matriarch, was approaching his office. Her perfectly coiffed silver hair and designer suit screamed old money, but it was her eyes that always caught attention, sharp, observant, and used to getting exactly what she wanted. "David, darling," she called out, her voice carrying that forced sweetness he'd grown to recognize. "I just heard about poor Isabel. Such terrible timing. But I'm sure you've already arranged for someone suitable to take her place." He straightened his tie, maintaining a professional smile. "Yes, Mrs. Richardson. I've secured one of our most talented soloists. She knows the Dying Swan variation perfectly." "Wonderful." Patricia's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "And she'll blend well with our aesthetic, I assume." David felt his jaw tighten slightly, but kept his voice steady. "She's exceptionally talented. The audience will be mesmerized." Patricia lingered, clearly waiting for more details, but David busied himself with paperwork. After a moment of awkward silence, she left, her heels clicking away down the hallway. As soon as she was gone, David pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to his friend Thomas, the lighting designer. "Heads up, we might have some drama tonight. Make sure Amara gets the best lighting you've ever done." Thomas' reply came quickly. "Finally making waves, are we? Count me in." David smiled, remembering all the conversations he and Thomas had shared about the need for change in their industry. Thomas had been the one who first pointed out Amara's talent during company rehearsals, noting how she brought something special to every role she touched. The afternoon ticked by with a flurry of activity. David watched as the grand ballroom transformed into a performance space. The crystal chandeliers were dimmed to create the perfect ambience, the temporary stage was set up with meticulous care, and the chairs were arranged in perfect rows. Everything had to be flawless, especially tonight. He overheard snippets of conversation from the catering staff, the musicians, the technical crew. Word had spread about Isabel's replacement, and the usual pre-event buzz carried an extra charge of anticipation. Some were excited about the change, while others whispered concerns about breaking tradition. At his desk, David found himself looking at old programs from previous Richardson galas. Year after year, the same type of dancer, the same traditional look. He thought about his own journey in this industry, how he had started as a junior coordinator, watching talented artists being overlooked for reasons that had nothing to do with their abilities. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Amara confirming she was on her way. He smiled, knowing that in just a few hours, the Richardsons' carefully maintained traditions would be challenged by pure talent. Sometimes, he thought, the most important changes happen not through grand gestures, but through small acts of defiance, through simply giving talent its rightful chance to shine. As the afternoon light began to fade, David stood at the window of his office, watching the first guests arrive in their expensive cars. Tonight would be different. Tonight, art would speak louder than prejudice. And maybe, just maybe, some minds would begin to change. He straightened his jacket and headed out to the entrance. It was time to set this evening's transformation in motion. Whatever happened next, he knew in his heart that he had made the right choice. Some traditions, after all, were meant to be broken. The evening air was crisp as Amara's taxi pulled up to the Richardson estate. Through the wrought iron gates, she could see the mansion glowing like a jewel against the darkening sky. String lights twinkled in the perfectly manicured gardens, and valets in red vests were parking luxury cars with practiced precision. Her heart fluttered as she stepped out of the taxi, her dance bag in one hand and her garment bag in the other. She had performed at fancy venues before, but this was different. The Richardson Gala was legendary in the city's social circle, and she could feel the weight of the opportunity in every step she took toward the entrance. The gravel crunched beneath her feet as she walked up the winding path. She had chosen to arrive in her warm-up clothes, simple black leggings and a loose sweater, saving her costume for later. As she approached the grand entrance, she noticed how conversations seemed to pause, how heads turned, how whispers followed in her wake. "Good evening," she said to the doorman, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm the performer for tonight's gala." The doorman's eyes widened slightly, but his professional training kicked in quickly. "Of course, miss. Mr. Chen is expecting you. Please follow me." Inside, the mansion was even more impressive. The entry hall ceiling soared 2 stories high, crowned with a crystal chandelier that scattered light like diamonds. The air smelled of fresh flowers and expensive perfume. Somewhere, a string quartet was warming up, their notes floating through the halls like gentle ghosts. As they rounded a corner, Amara saw David Chen talking with an older couple, clearly the Richardsons. Mrs. Richardson wore a midnight blue evening gown that probably cost more than Amara's yearly rent, while Mr. Richardson's tuxedo spoke of old money and older traditions. "Ah, here she is." David's voice carried a forced brightness as he turned to make introductions. "Mr. and Mrs. Richardson, this is Amara, our soloist for this evening." The change in their expressions was subtle but unmistakable. Mrs. Richardson's perfect smile froze in place, while Mr. Richardson's handshake was so brief it barely qualified as contact. "We were so sorry to hear about Isabel's illness," Mrs. Richardson said, her voice tight. "She's been our featured performer for the past 5 years." Unfamiliar with her interpretation of The Dying Swan, Amara replied politely, "It's a beautiful piece." Before anyone could respond, a young girl appeared from behind the Richardsons. She looked about 16, wearing a deep purple dress that made her stand out from the sea of black and white formal wear. Her eyes lit up when she saw Amara. "Are you really dancing tonight?" she asked, stepping forward eagerly. "I saw you practice this piece at the company's open rehearsal last month. Your port de bras in the final sequence was incredible." Mrs. Richardson's face tightened further. "Lily, darling, why don't you go check on the flower arrangements in the ballroom?" But Lily stood her ground. "Mom, you should have seen her dance. She does this thing with her arms in the final moments that makes you feel like you're actually watching a swan's last breath. It's amazing." Amara felt warmth spread through her chest at the girl's genuine enthusiasm. In that moment, she remembered why she danced, not for the critics, not for the traditionalists, but for moments like these, when art could bridge any gap. "Thank you," she said softly to Lily. "That means a lot to me." David cleared his throat. "We should get you to the dressing room. The performance starts in an hour." As they walked away, Amara could hear the whispered argument erupting behind them. Lily's voice carried clearly, "Mom, why are you being like this? She's incredible." The dressing room turned out to be a converted study, with heavy wooden bookshelves lining the walls and a full-length mirror brought in especially for the occasion. As Amara began her warm-up routine, she could hear the mansion coming alive with the sounds of arriving guests. She thought about Lily's words as she stretched, about the pure appreciation in the girl's eyes that had nothing to do with skin color and everything to do with art. Maybe that was the key. Maybe change didn't always come from the top down, but from the young ones who hadn't yet learned to see the world through prejudiced eyes. As she prepared for her performance, Amara made a decision. Tonight, she wouldn't just dance for herself, or for her community, or even for change. Tonight, she would dance for Lily, and for every other young person who saw art before they saw differences. Sometimes, she realized, the most powerful statement you could make was simply to be undeniably, unquestionably excellent at what you do. The sound of the string quartet tuning up drifted through the door. Soon, it would be time. Amara stood in front of the mirror, adjusted her costume one last time, and took a deep breath. The night was young, and anything was possible. Behind the scenes, the Richardson mansion had erupted into quiet chaos. Mrs. Richardson paced the private family sitting room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors like an angry metronome. Mr. Richardson stood by the fireplace, swirling his scotch with more force than necessary. "This is completely unacceptable," Mrs. Richardson whispered fiercely to David, who stood calmly by the door. "You know very well what our guests expect. This isn't it's about tradition." David kept his voice steady. "Mrs. Richardson, Amara is one of our most talented soloists. Your guests expect excellence, and that's exactly what they'll get." "There must be someone else available," Mr. Richardson cut in. "What about that lovely girl from the spring showcase?" On such short notice, there is no one else who knows the piece this well, David replied. Through the door, he could hear guests filling the ballroom, their excited chatter mixing with the string quartet's warm-up scales. Lily burst into the room, her purple dress swishing. "Mom, people are asking why we're not in the ballroom yet. The performance is supposed to start in 20 minutes. Mrs. Richardson pressed her fingers to her temples. "Lily, please understand. This gala has been our family's tradition for 30 years. Every detail matters." "Yeah, it matters that we put on an amazing show," Lily shot back. "And if you actually watched Amara dance instead of just sitting." "That's enough," Mr. Richardson cut in sharply. "Lily, go help your aunt greet the guests." But Lily stood her ground. "No, I'm tired of this. Do you know what people at school would say if they knew how you were acting? It's 2025, not 1955. The room fell silent. Even Mrs. Richardson seemed taken aback by her daughter's outburst. Down the hall, in the makeshift dressing room, Amara could hear fragments of the heated discussion as she finished her warm-up. Her muscles were ready, her mind was focused, but her heart ached at the familiar sound of doors being closed before they were even opened. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. It was Thomas, the lighting designer, coming to check the spotlight settings. "Don't let them get to you," he said quietly as he adjusted the lights. "I've worked these events for years, and trust me, talent speaks louder than their whispers." Amara nodded, grateful for the kindness. I wish they could see past their preconceptions for just one moment." "Then make them," Thomas replied with a gentle smile. "That's the power of art, isn't it? To make people see things differently." Back in the sitting room, the argument had reached a crescendo. Mrs. Richardson had moved from thinly veiled suggestions to outright demands that David find another solution. But something had shifted in the room. Perhaps it was Lily's words, or perhaps it was the weight of 30 years of tradition suddenly feeling more like a burden than a badge of honor. David's phone buzzed. A text from one of the ushers. "The governor's wife is asking about the delay," he read aloud. "And the press is waiting to cover the performance." Mr. Richardson's face tightened. "The press? You invited the press?" "They come every year," David reminded him calmly. "To cover the charitable donations and, of course, the performance." The implications hung in the air. A last-minute cancellation or replacement would raise questions that would be much harder to answer than any discomfort they might feel about breaking their unspoken traditions. In the dressing room, Amara stood before the mirror one last time. Her white tutu caught the light perfectly, each crystal sending tiny rainbows dancing across the walls. She thought about all the little girls who had ever stood in front of mirrors like this, dreaming of moments like this, only to be told they didn't fit someone else's image of a ballerina. She thought about Lily's passionate defense, about Thomas's quiet support, about David's brave choice. Sometimes, she realized, change happened not in grand gestures, but in small moments of courage, in people willing to stand up, to speak out, to simply show up and do what they were born to do. The clock struck 7. In the ballroom, the string quartet had finished warming up. The guests were seated, programs in hand, waiting for the performance to begin. The spotlight was ready, the stage was set, and somewhere in that audience, a young girl in a purple dress was about to watch her faith in art's power to transcend prejudice either proven or shattered. Amara took a deep breath and walked toward the stage entrance. Behind her, she could still hear the muffled sounds of protest and panic. But ahead of her lay something more important, a chance to prove that beauty knows no boundaries, that talent deserves its moment, that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice is simply to rise above it and dance. The ballroom fell silent as the lights dimmed. 300 pairs of eyes focused on the makeshift stage, where a single spotlight carved a perfect circle of light. The string quartet began the first haunting notes of Saint-Saëns' The Swan, and Amara stepped into the light. From the moment her toe touched the floor, something magical happened. There was no longer a controversial replacement dancer, no whispers about tradition, no tension about broken expectations. There was only movement and music, perfectly intertwined. Amara's arms floated up like wings, her movements so fluid they seemed to defy human limitation. Each gesture told a story, not just of a dying swan, but of struggle, of beauty, of the fight to survive against impossible odds. Her body created shapes that seemed to hang in the air, defying gravity and prejudice in equal measure. In the front row, Mrs. Richardson sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. But as Amara moved across the stage, something in the older woman's expression began to change. There was a softening around her eyes, a slight parting of her lips, as if she was seeing something she had never expected to find. Mr. Richardson, who had been checking his phone moments before, now sat transfixed. He had seen this piece performed dozens of times over the years, but never like this. Never with such raw emotion, such undeniable grace. Lily, seated between her parents, didn't bother hiding her tears. She watched every movement with the kind of pure joy that only comes from witnessing something truly extraordinary. Her hands were pressed against her heart, as if trying to hold in all the emotions Amara's dance was stirring up. In the back of the room, David stood with Thomas, who had perfectly orchestrated the lighting to follow Amara's every movement. The spotlight seemed to breathe with her, expanding and contracting as she moved through the space, creating an almost otherworldly effect. The other guests, many of whom had arrived with their own prejudices and expectations, found themselves holding their breath at particularly beautiful moments. A renowned art critic wiped a tear from his eye. The governor's wife leaned forward in her seat, completely forgetting about her perfectly arranged gown. As Amara moved through the choreography, she poured everything she had into each gesture. This wasn't just about proving herself anymore, it was about showing everyone in that room what was possible when art was allowed to speak its own truth. Her porte de bras was more than just arm movements, it was a declaration of dignity. Her jumps were more than just technical skills, they were assertions of her right to take up space in this world. The music built to its emotional peak, and Amara's movements became more fragile, more desperate. The dying swan's struggle became a metaphor for something larger, the struggle against prejudice, against limitation, against all the voices that said, "You don't belong here." In that moment, the Richardsons' ballroom became more than just a room in a mansion. It became a space where change was happening in real time, where preconceptions were dissolving in the face of undeniable talent, where art was doing what it does best, breaking down barriers and building bridges in their place. Near the end of the piece, Amara performed the famous final sequence, the one Lily had praised earlier. Her arms moved with such delicate precision that they truly seemed to capture a swan's last breath. The entire room held its breath with her, caught in the spell of the moment. As the final notes faded away, Amara completed the choreography exactly as it was meant to be done, the swan's final surrender to fate. She lay still on the stage, the spotlight creating a halo around her form, the silence in the room absolute. For one long moment, no one moved, no one breathed. It was as if everyone in the room knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary, something that had changed them in ways they couldn't yet understand. Then, from somewhere in the back of the room, someone began to clap. The sound was joined by another, then another, until the entire ballroom erupted in thunderous applause. People began to stand, first in small groups, then in waves, until the entire audience was on their feet. Lily was the first to shout, "Bravo!" Her voice broke the formal atmosphere, giving others permission to express their own enthusiasm. Soon, the room was filled with cheers and calls for an encore. As Amara rose to take a bow, she saw something she hadn't expected. Mrs. Richardson, standing with tears in her eyes, clapping as hard as anyone else. Mr. Richardson stood beside her, his usual stern expression replaced by one of genuine awe. In that moment, as the applause washed over her like a wave, Amara understood something profound. Sometimes the most powerful way to change people's minds isn't through arguments or confrontation, but through excellence, through beauty, through art that speaks so truthfully that it leaves no room for prejudice to hide. The applause had barely died down when Lily broke free from her parents and rushed backstage. She found Amara in the dressing room, still catching her breath from the performance, her face glowing with a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. "That was the most amazing thing I've ever seen." Lily burst out, her words tumbling over each other in excitement. "The way you moved in the final sequence, it was like you weren't even touching the ground. And when you did that series of turns, everyone around me gasped." Amara couldn't help but smile at the girl's enthusiasm. She was carefully removing her point shoes, her fingers working at the satin ribbons with practiced care. "Thank you," she said softly. "It means a lot to hear that." "Would you?" Lily hesitated for a moment, then plunged ahead. "Would you consider teaching me? I mean, I take classes at the city ballet school, but I've never seen anyone dance like you do." Before Amara could respond, Mrs. Richardson appeared in the doorway. The room grew quiet, the air thick with unspoken tension. But something had changed in the older woman's face. The careful mask of social propriety had cracked, revealing something more genuine underneath. That was... Mrs. Richardson paused, searching for words. "I've seen the Dying Swan performed many times, but never quite like that. You made us feel every moment, every emotion." She took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology. My behavior earlier was inexcusable." Amara stood, wrapping her warm-up sweater around her shoulders. "Thank you," she said simply, maintaining her dignity. "Aunt has a way of helping us see beyond our preconceptions." "Mom," Lily spoke up, her voice full of hope. "I asked Amara if she would consider teaching me. Could she, please?" Mrs. Richardson looked at her daughter, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time seeing not just her child, but a young woman with dreams of her own. "I think that would be wonderful," she said quietly. Then, turning to Amara, "If you're willing, of course." In the ballroom, guests were still buzzing about the performance. The governor's wife was telling anyone who would listen that she'd discovered an amazing new talent. Art critics were furiously typing notes into their phones. David stood near the refreshment table, trying not to look too pleased with himself as he overheard snippets of excited conversation. Mr. Richardson approached him, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. "I suppose," he said, offering one to David, "that sometimes tradition needs a little updating." He cleared his throat. "You made the right call today." Back in the dressing room, Amara was showing Lily some basic arm positions, the young girl mimicking her movements with intense concentration. Mrs. Richardson watched from the doorway, her eyes misty as she observed her daughter's joy. "You know," Mrs. Richardson said softly, "this gala began 30 years ago because my mother loved ballet. She used to say that dance was a universal language that could speak to anyone's heart. I think somewhere along the way, we forgot that." The sound of approaching footsteps made them all look up. It was Thomas, the lighting designer, with an unexpected announcement. "The press wants photos," he said, grinning. "They're calling it the performance of the season." Lily clapped her hands excitedly. "Can I be in the photos too? Please?" Mrs. Richardson smoothed her daughter's hair with a gentle hand. "Of course, dear. But first, let's give Amara a moment to rest. It's been quite an evening." As everyone filed out, Amara took a moment to herself. She looked in the mirror, seeing not just her reflection, but all the doors that had just opened, not just for her, but for every dancer who would come after her. A text message lit up her phone. It was from her mother. "How did it go, sweetheart?" With trembling fingers, Amara began to type her response, knowing that no words could fully capture the magic of what had just happened. Outside the dressing room, she could hear Lily chattering excitedly about ballet classes, Mrs. Richardson making plans for future performances, and the continued buzz of amazed guests. The evening had transformed from a potential disaster into something miraculous, a moment when art had done what it does best: open hearts, change minds, and remind everyone that beauty knows no boundaries. As she gathered her things to join the others, Amara remembered something her first ballet teacher had told her: dance isn't just about moving your body, it's about moving people's hearts. Tonight, she had done exactly that, and in doing so, had changed not just her own future, but perhaps the future of ballet itself. 1 year later, the Richardson mansion was once again filled with the sound of classical music. But this time, something was different. The annual gala had transformed into something more meaningful than just a social event. In the grand ballroom, now converted into a practice space, Amara stood watching a group of young dancers warm up at the bar. Lily was among them, her face serious with concentration as she worked on her technique. The past year had seen her progress from an enthusiastic beginner to a dedicated student with real potential. Mrs. Richardson entered quietly, carrying a stack of papers. "The scholarship applications are pouring in," she said, her voice warm with excitement. "We've received twice as many as last year." The Richardson Dance Foundation, established in the wake of last year's transformative performance, had become a force for change in the ballet world. What began as a simple scholarship fund had grown into a comprehensive program supporting young dancers from all backgrounds. "The summer intensive program is almost full," Amara replied, adjusting a young dancer's arm position with gentle hands. "And 3 of our students have been accepted into prestigious ballet academies." The sound of cars pulling up outside signaled the arrival of this year's gala guests. But unlike last year, there was no tension, no whispered concerns about tradition. Instead, there was anticipation for what had become known as one of the most innovative arts events in the city. In the entrance hall, David greeted the arriving guests with a quiet sense of satisfaction. The press was there again, but this time they were covering more than just a single performance. They were documenting a revolution in the ballet world, one that had started with a last-minute replacement and grown into something much bigger. Thomas, still the lighting designer but now also a board member of the foundation, was setting up for tonight's showcase. This year's performance would feature not just one dancer, but a diverse group of talented artists, including some of Amara's most promising students. "Remember when we were worried about breaking tradition?" he asked David with a smile. "Now we're setting new ones." Upstairs, in what had once been the family sitting room, but was now a dancer's lounge, pictures lined the walls, newspaper clippings, performance photos, and candid shots of classes and rehearsals. At the center was a large photograph from last year's gala. Amara in her white tutu, caught in a perfect moment of grace, with Lily watching from the wings, had a face full of dreams. Mr. Richardson stood studying these photos, his hands clasped behind his back. "You know," he said to no one in particular, "sometimes the best traditions are the ones we haven't created yet." As the evening approached, the young dancers gathered in the makeshift dressing rooms, helping each other with makeup and hair. There was nervous excitement in the air, but also a sense of belonging. These walls, which had once seemed so exclusionary, now echoed with laughter and shared dreams. Lily, now preparing for her first public performance, sat at the mirror while Amara helped her with her costume. "Do you ever get nervous anymore?" she asked, fidgeting with her tutu. Amara smiled, remembering her own first performances. "Every single time," she admitted. "But that's how you know it matters." In the ballroom, the guests began to take their seats. The governor's wife was there again, along with arts patrons, dance critics, and families of the performers. But there were new faces too, children from local dance schools, aspiring artists, and community members who had never thought ballet could be for them. Mrs. Richardson took the stage to make her opening remarks. "A year ago," she began, her voice clear and strong, "we thought we knew what tradition meant. We thought we knew what ballet should look like. But we learned something important that night, that art, true art, knows no boundaries. It speaks to all of us if only we're willing to listen."